This is a CBS News special report. I'm Norah O'Donnell here in the nation's capital. And an extraordinary day today. You are looking now at live pictures as former President Donald Trump heads to the federal courthouse. He will be arraigned just blocks from the U.S. Capitol and the White House over his efforts to overturn the 2020 election and try and remain in office. Now, this indictment, which was handed down Tuesday, describes what is called as a criminal scheme to keep Trump in office, which culminated in the insurrection at the Capitol on January 6, 2021. And even before that, Trump engaged in a pressure campaign targeting state election workers, lawmakers, and others, according to this indictment. And it also details Trump's efforts to use the machinery of government, including his own Justice Department, to help him cling to power. This will be the former president's third criminal arraignment this year. He is also, we should note, the early frontrunner for the Republican presidential nomination. Now, Trump and his lawyers are defending his actions as expressions of free speech. But even his own Attorney General Bill Barr saying just last night, free speech does not protect you from entering into a conspiracy. The other really interesting thing about this 45-page indictment, if you read through it, is that it notes the role of the former Vice President Mike Pence, who told reporters just yesterday that anyone who puts themselves over the Constitution should never be president of the United States. The former president arrived in Washington not long ago. These are the pictures of him landing at Reagan National Airport from his residence in Bedminster, New Jersey, and now his motorcade arriving at the E. Barrett Prettyman Federal Courthouse to appear before a magistrate. And we will get the details now from our own chief Washington correspondent, Major Garrett. He is outside the courthouse there. Good afternoon, Major.
Good afternoon, Nora. I will tell you that the atmosphere outside this courthouse is one of very quiet anticipation. Very few people here looking at this from the outside. A great number of media representatives, probably 100 cameras or more here to record this historic event. The former president is inside the courthouse you see behind me, first to be processed. What does that mean? That means he will be digitally fingerprinted. He will have to answer a couple of questions. That will all be handled by a magistrate judge. Then the president, the former president, will appear before a trial judge and enter a plea of not guilty. This should all take, we are told, somewhere between 30 and 45 minutes. The atmosphere out here, very calm, very quiet, to the degree that there are those either advocating on behalf of the former president or opposing him. Their interactions are civil, very mild-mannered. There is a very large security presence here. This courthouse, Nora, as you well know in the geography of Washington, D.C., is at the intersection of Constitution and Pennsylvania Avenue, which means, of course, that this moment is where history, law, and politics come full circle, because on January 6, 2021, some of the protesters who went to the west front of the Capitol and some who entered it passed by this very courthouse. From where I'm standing, I can see the west front of the Capitol here. So it's all converging back where it started on that fateful day. And Nora, I can also tell you that the security here is occupied by Capitol Police, U.S. Marshals, Secret Service. Constitution Avenue and Pennsylvania Avenue, which I just referred to, have been closed down. That's a recent development here. Until a few moments ago, traffic was flowing freely. But the atmosphere around here is not tense. There is no sense of civil hostility, just quiet anticipation.
We are not hearing of any specific or credible plans for any type of disturbances at this hour. But, Major, you point out how that major intersection now shut down as the former president arriving there. Let's bring in our chief election and campaign correspondent, Robert Costa. I know you've been speaking with your sources this morning. What have you learned?
So this is a legal reckoning for former President Trump. He's arriving in Washington not to have a quiet lunch at the White House, but to come to a courthouse and to be accused of trying to defraud the country he once led. The gravity of all this is juxtaposed by the levity inside of Trump's inner circle. Talking to his allies in the last hour, some of them traveling with him, they say he's bored by this. They believe that he can consolidate his support now inside the Republican Party. And as much as he's facing scrutiny from the Justice Department, he's not facing it from his own party, the Republican Party, who continues to push him in many quarters to be their nominee.
Let's point out that the legal experts say that the 4 counts that are laid out in this indictment against Donald Trump are the most serious charges in all of the cases that he is facing. It also marks the first time in American history that the President of the United States, current or former, is being charged for conduct while in office. The former president is charged with conspiracy to defraud the United States, conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding, obstruction of and attempt to obstruct an official proceeding, and conspiracy against rights. Now, the 3 conspiracies are detailed further in the indictment, and they are this: conspiracy to defraud the United States, and that relates to Trump's alleged efforts to overturn the results of the 2020 election using dishonesty, fraud, and deceit. Also, conspiracy to obstruct the January 6th congressional proceeding and the counting of the electoral votes of the 2020 election, and conspiracy against voting rights, which goes to the very heart of American democracy. That is the right to have your vote counted. And of course, the special counsel alleging that that is something the president tried to prevent. The special counsel, Jack Smith, spoke Tuesday following the unsealing of the indictment, and he detailed how the former president allegedly orchestrated this conspiracy to overturn the 2020 election.
The attack on our nation's capital on January 6, 2021, was an unprecedented assault on the seat of American democracy. As described in the indictment, it was fueled by lies. Lies by the defendant targeted at obstructing a bedrock function of the U.S. government, the nation's process of collecting, counting, and certifying the results of the presidential election.
Also joining us is our chief political analyst, John Dickerson. And John, I was struck when I heard the special counsel say that, of course, of Inauguration Day, when the new president comes and swears up there on the west front of the Capitol before the American people and all those that are watching to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. And now the commander-in-chief is accused of doing something else than that, to not holding true with that pledge.
That's exactly right. The person given this tremendous power used that power to attack the system that he swears to defend. That's at the heart of this. And the reason this matters, it's extraordinary to hear Bob's reporting that the former president is bored by this. This is the vital beating heart of our democracy. And one of the things that happens in justice, we've often heard this in cases, is that, prosecutors or judges will say that justice does not sleep. It doesn't get bored, because when things are at stake, as serious as this isn't some parking ticket. Justice stays on the case. And that's what's happening here. And this isn't just about what happened 2.5 years ago. These are vital questions today. What's more important, conspiracies or facts? What's more important, partisanship or country? What's more important, violence or the system? Those are all still live questions in our public debates today, and they'll be live going into the election next year.
Mm-hmm. Well put. Jeff Pegues covers the Justice Department for us. And on that matter, the Justice Department has been quite busy. This is the largest criminal case in American history, beginning with many of those defendants who are charged and have been convicted in assaulting the U.S. Capitol on January 6th.
Which makes you wonder why a defendant would consider himself bored with cases like this. Most people on earth would be shaking in their boots. I mean, these are pretty serious charges that could lead to pretty serious jail time. And they have the special counsel's office working overtime, essentially, to bring these charges against this former president. Because when you take on an adversary like this, you have to be prepared. You have to have your facts straight. And that's in part why we have this 45-page indictment here. There is a lot in here, but I'm sure they have more.
I want to bring in Robert Costa again. And Robert, walk us through what essentially is in this indictment, because in addition to these charges, we also get a glimpse of some of the evidence that the special counsel has.
A lot of evidence. But what's important to recognize when you digest this document is that this indictment was issued against former President Trump while the investigation continues. So the special counsel, Jack Smith, is still pressing some of these alleged co-conspirators and other witnesses to further further cooperate with the government as they build the case against Trump. It's almost like you're trying to fix the plane or change a plane's engine while it's landing. This is a lot of work going on simultaneously inside the Justice Department. And what this indictment shows, in brief, is a former president, then in the White House, was orchestrating a scheme that played off on many fronts. It wasn't just Trump asking someone to try to overturn the election. It was Trump, based on this indictment, leaning on members of Congress, leaning on people at the Justice Department, leaning on his own lawyers, leaning on state Republican officials and election officials, trying to get all of them to enlist in this idea that the election was stolen, a false claim. The
criminal scheme, it's called.
And the reason it's called a criminal scheme by the special counsel is he is building evidence about this crucial period, Nora, a couple days after the election. And he believes he has evidence that shows Trump acknowledged privately that he lost the election. Now, the special counsel has evidence that Trump acknowledged this privately and then pursued a whole conspiracy, allegedly, based on the premise that he didn't lose the election. Then that's the basis for this allegation of fraud, that Trump knew he lost, yet still pursued the presidency through corrupt means based on this indictment.
And it's on the very first page of the indictment. These claims about that the election was stolen were false, and the defendant knew they were false. Why is that so critical? It's
so critical because Trump and his lawyers are preparing an argument that lawyers on the outside gave him an exit ramp to stay in the presidency, another path. But if he knowingly said the election was over, and I have reporting that he, in the days after the election, told one of his top advisors, Kellyanne Conway, he said something to the effect of, "I can't believe I lost this election to Joe Biden. I can't believe I lost." The fact that he said that to different associates behind the scenes means that everything that came after that post-election period was a conspiracy based on false claims, because Trump knew that he had lost the election. If he knew he lost the election, yet still tried to push all these people to keep him in power, that is seen as criminal intent. The criminal intent to stay in office, not just to have the belief that you rigged the election and that the election was rigged and that you could do this.
But Trump's lawyers say, but that's his free speech. He's allowed to do that.
You can express a lot of criticism about the election, and Trump's lawyers will continue to argue free speech. But as former Attorney General William Barr has said in recent days and on CBS News in recent weeks, criticizing the election is one thing, but then pressuring people to keep you in power, using all of the different levers at your disposal as president of the United States, is different than expressing free speech. In the eyes of the special counsel, it's not free speech, it's abuse of power.
And free speech is not absolute. There are lots and lots of limits on free speech. You can't say certain kinds of things, and you certainly can't say certain kinds of things in furtherance of a crime. And that's why the focus here is on the fraud, the crimes that were committed, the conspiracy that he went into. That's the important piece, not the fact that he was speaking.
And in the indictment, of course, also details stuff that is other than speech. It's conduct, specific conduct.
And the main thing you have to recognize here is the special counsel has done more work than any previous investigation on detailing how Trump tried to enlist people to be so-called fake electors or alternate electors. He wanted to essentially throw out votes, allegedly, in all of these different states and have Republicans in those states send new slates back to Washington. Think about how unique this is historically. In December of 2020, as our Constitution states, the Electoral College votes. And then on January 6, 2021, it was supposed to be a formality, a certification. It's like Congress puts a stamp on something that's already been done.
I mean, we'd never really even covered it before until this year, this past election.
But then in December 30th, 2020, Trump and his allies in Congress, they say, wait a minute, this is maybe a certification on January 6th, but we're going to use this as an opportunity to attempt to throw out some of these votes and to not have it be about a certification, but an objection, and to send the election back to the states and then back to the House. I know this is convoluted, but I want to make one quick point. What Trump ultimately wanted to do here, if you're wondering, well, what was the scheme about? What was this really about? Trump wanted the election to go into the House of Representatives, because if it went into the House of Representatives, Trump believed the Republican delegations there would be able to vote him, as our Constitution lays out. It's called a contingent election. Trump could win a second term if he could just push the election into the House of Representatives. It was a winding path, but Trump was so convinced he could do it that he pressured his vice president, his most loyal soldier of all people, to try to put this into motion.
And it wasn't just his vice president. It was members of Congress. Even on the day of the certification, the president and his allies were calling members of Congress. They were calling senators. They were pressuring secretaries of state. They were pressuring governors, trying to go anywhere they could to either overthrow the results in various states or to get these lawmakers to halt the count so they could continue to push their case. Went way beyond free speech.
We've got lots to get to in terms of digging into some of the legal arguments, and we've got our team here to discuss that as well. We may also hear later today from Trump himself as well as his attorney, but want to give everybody a sense about what is going to happen here. Today's proceedings, because they are scheduled down to the minute. An official tells CBS News that the former president will be processed by the U.S. Marshals at the federal courthouse before being taken into the courtroom. Now, this process is going to mirror that in Trump's first federal arraignment in Miami. We were all there for that. And then Trump's fingerprints will be collected by a digital scanner, but he will not have a mugshot taken today. The former president will then make his initial court appearance, where he is expected to plead not guilty, and then he is expected to return home to his club in Bedminster, New Jersey. Let's bring in congressional correspondent Scott McFarland. He is inside the courthouse. And Scott, describe what you're seeing.
We're in the second story of the courthouse, room 22. Court 22 is where the former president will appear. He is going to appear before Magistrate Judge Mokshila Upadhyay. The crowd has already been seated here, Nora. There are two different sets of wooden benches in rows, and there are two long tables. To the judge's left will be the special counsel attorneys, and we expect Jack Smith in the room, too. To the judge's right will be former President Trump and his legal team. If he enters through a back entrance, he'll be able to avoid walking through that crowd. If he goes through the main entrance of the doors, there's a double door, a little foyer, then another double door. He'll walk into this room, which is about the size of a small elementary school gymnasium. Floor to ceilings, light brown wood. But behind the judge is this big white marble wall, U.S. flag, and a big seal over the wall, at the top of the wall. And she'll be administering the plea entering, the release conditions, any other instructions, and any other questions from the attorneys. When former President Trump enters, he'll go to that table, take his seat on a black rolling chair, and wait for the judge to call things to order. Couple notes. This cavernous courthouse, one of the most bustling and busy in America, has pretty much ground to a halt today. They slid a lot of small matters off the calendar. They moved cases to next week to free up space and free up some security to do their work. And just now entering the courthouse, as the proceedings are about to begin, U.S. Capitol Police Officer Harry Dunn and retired Sergeant Aquilino Gonell, two of the most outspoken police who were part of that January 6th response. Nora, it underscores something. This case, unlike the others, happening right here in the nation's capital, just feet away from where the attack happened.
All right, Scott McFarland, thank you. Also outside the courthouse, we are hearing now from Alina Habba. She is an attorney and spokeswoman for Donald J. Trump. Let's listen in.
The fact that I am standing here for the third time in 5 months is not a coincidence. This is the Biden political lawfare that we have seen time and time again. It is a deflection from everything that they have done. And if you don't believe me, look at the facts. On March 17th, Hunter accidentally admits that it was his laptop from hell. The next day, DA Alvin Bragg indicts President Trump. June 8th, an FBI document is released showing that the Ukrainians paid the Biden crime family millions and millions of dollars. The next day, the Mar-a-Lago raid and the Mar-a-Lago indictment. Last week, Hunter Biden's sweetheart plea deal fell through when the judge realized it had blanket immunity. The following day, a superseding indictment against Donald Trump. July 31st, Devin Archer goes to testify in front of the House. That was only after they failed to put him in jail prior to the fact. What happens the next day? The January 6th indictment that we're here for today. This is not a coincidence. This is election interference at its finest against the leading candidate right now for president, for either party. President Trump is under siege in a way that we have never seen before. President Trump and his legal team and everyone on his team will continue to fight, not for him, but for the American people. I'll take some questions.
Thank you. I know the president has called this a witch hunt. You just laid out several examples of that. Any other thoughts that the president has communicated to you in terms of why this is going on and then why he calls it a witch hunt?
I think a witch hunt is really the way that anybody should describe this, because it's not something we've seen in our time. This is not even political. This is beyond that. A witch hunt is when you relentlessly attack your opponent, when you relentlessly attack the thing that you are most afraid of. People are afraid of somebody that cannot be bought by Washington. People are afraid of somebody who is independently wealthy and who has given up his good life to fight for this country. And that frightens a lot of politicians who are career politicians, unfortunately, because he'll get back there, and I know he'll be fighting for every one of us so that this doesn't happen to us.
And that is Alina Habba, who is a spokesperson and attorney who represents Donald Trump as a spokesperson. But as you noted, of course, noting this is a political prosecution, she is saying, of Donald Trump, but she did not address any of the specifics that were outlined in this indictment by the special counsel, Jack Smith, or rebutting the conspiracy or obstruction charges. I wanted to bring in our chief Washington correspondent, Major Garrett, as he was listening along as well. Major, your take.
So the judge in this case, when it comes to trial, is not going to be interested in what happened or didn't happen to Hunter Biden. The judge will be interested in the evidence presented that either backs up or doesn't back up the indictment provided by the special counsel, Jack Smith. Now, Alina Habba, speaking on behalf of the former president, wants to make an association in timing between developments regarding Hunter Biden and the former president. That's an interesting story. It has a narrative arc that the former president's campaign believes is persuasive, but it is utterly immaterial in a court of law. And when she talks about the weaponization of the Justice Department, at least in this case, it is worth noting, Nora, as you well know, and as Bob Costa knows from his very thorough reporting, the fact witnesses in this case all worked for former President Trump in one capacity or another, either inside the White House, inside the Trump campaign, within the legal circle that the president assumed or created after he was frustrated by the campaign lawyers that told him he had lost the election fair and square. So the fact witnesses are not part of any cabal seeking to undermine or deflate the political prospects of the former president. They were those hired by him to serve the country or serve his campaign or serve his various legal challenges. One other observation I would make. Earlier today, the former president on his social media platform said he is being arrested, quote unquote, he's being processed for challenging a corrupt and stolen election. He is not being processed or arrested for challenging that election. He had every right, as every candidate does, to legally challenge an election. He lost nearly 60 of those challenges in open court, and often the most harsh denunciations of the lack of evidence and lack of standing brought before various courts were written by Trump-appointed judges. He is not being processed or arrested, and this indictment is not about lawful challenging of election. It is about, as Robert has pointed out, a concerted effort, once being told over and over again that the election was lost, that legal challenges have failed, extra legal maneuvers were undertaken to thwart the will of the people.
You outlined that so well, Major Garrett. Thank you. John Dickerson.
I just want to say briefly, what Alina Habba was doing just there is what I was talking about earlier. The issues at stake here happened 2.5 years ago, but we see in just this moment claiming things that are not true or talking about things that are over here and not focusing on the central point. That's what happened 2.5 years ago, and we see it happening afresh, and that's why this discussion of what happened 2.5 years ago, whether we can look at the facts as they are, is still a live one and is being presented right there before us in terms of whether we can seriously adjudicate this moment that was one of the most serious in American history.
I want to drill down on one of the points that Major made, which is that much of the evidence here is from Republican officials that served alongside the former president. Not only, we believe, his chief of staff, Mark Meadows, but most importantly, the vice president, Mike Pence, because Pence or the office of the vice presidency is mentioned over 100 times in a 45-page indictment. Little did we know that Mike Pence was taking contemporaneous notes of these conversations with Donald Trump, which are detailed in this indictment, including two particular phone calls that stood out to me on Christmas Day and on New Year's Day. Robert?
And Mike Pence was on vacation in late December of 2020, and Steve Bannon, Trump's longtime advisor, infamously called Trump on December 30th, 2020, and said, "Get Pence off the ski slopes and get him back to Washington because we need to use him now to make him our weapon on January 6th. For Mike Pence, what a journey. I used to cover him in the House of Representatives. He was a conservative from Indiana. He called himself Rush Limbaugh on decaf. He hosted a radio show in the industrial heartland. Now he's the key witness in a historic federal investigation of the man he was loyal to for so years. He did take contemporaneous notes, and he was talking to his trusted lawyers and advisors, Mark Short and Greg Jacob, who both cooperated with the January 6th committee as witnesses all the time. And I think about that famous moment in January 5th, 2021, the eve of the insurrection. Pence is in the Oval with Trump one-on-one. And when he exits the Oval Office after being berated by Trump, who said, "Mike, you have to do what I want you to do. Listen to the mob outside." One of Pence's closest friends, Tom Rose, sees Pence come out of the Oval Office, and he says to others in the room, Pence was as white as a ghost. It was like he was in a hospital and gotten bad news. It was the most traumatic moment of his vice presidency because Trump, in essence, was asking him, in the view of Pence's advisors, to break the law. And
doesn't he use a particular word at some point to insult Mike Pence as well?
He does. He uses many words, some of them expletives we shouldn't mention on CBS News.
I only say that because that wasn't the only time that he had berated Mike Pence.
He did it publicly on January 4th. He did it on January 6th at the rally.
Well, and on Christmas Day, Mike Pence, a Christian man, called to say to the president, "Merry Christmas." Then the conversation, according to Pence's notes, quickly turned to the election and the pressure campaign and to throw out these electoral votes. And Pence told the special counsel, "I don't think I have the authority to change the outcome." And then on New Year's Day, again, a berating by President Trump to Mike Pence about that. And Mike Pence says, "I don't think I can do that. There's no constitutional basis." And at that point, Trump says to him, to Mike Pence, "You're too honest."
And Mike Pence is now selling merch in his bid for the presidency that says Mike Pence too honest on it. It's almost as if he has been sort of unchained by the fact that this indictment has now been released. He's speaking out more forcefully against the former president than he has in the past. He says the president was more loyal, wanted him to be loyal to Trump, not to the Constitution. But what is he getting from Republican voters in return? Not much. According to recent polls, Nora, Mike Pence is at 3%, and the other Republican candidates who are willing to speak out routinely against President Trump, they're basically in the same boat. Will Hurd, Chris Christie, Asa Hutchinson, when you add up all of these candidates together, they've got about 6% of the Republican electorate, while the president's support, the former president's support, is only growing.
I just want to note we are showing from the indictment on page 33 that conversation that I was just detailing that happened on New Year's Day, where the Trump says to the vice president, "You're too honest." And then as the indictment lays out here, that within an hours of that conversation, the defendant, otherwise known as Donald Trump, reminded his supporters to meet in Washington before the certification, tweeting, "The big protest rally in Washington will take place at 11 a.m. Stop this."
And just to grasp the obvious here, this is not only amusing because Mike Pence is selling merchandise with "too honest" on it, but it suggests that the president knew what he was asking Mike Pence to do was dishonest, and therefore he knew what he was doing, which is one of the things that the special counsel is alleging.
You are so good at setting me up here, and thank you, Nancy, because if Mike Pence is using that slogan in this kind of political environment, not sure that works these days, being too honest, so it's an interesting approach. But I also wanted to talk about about the three cases that the spokesperson for President Trump, former President Trump, pointed out. Three cases. This case is different. Okay, you have the classified documents case, you have the case in Manhattan, but this is not a victimless case. And I think people sort of get caught up in the politics of it all. But again, people were injured, more than 100 officers injured. You had officers who died as a result. You're going to have family members in the courtroom. You're going to have former officers in the courtroom. This is not a victimless crime. This is different.
And even getting outside of Washington, D.C., you had poll workers whose lives were threatened. You had people who worked to adjudicate these elections who felt that they were personally threatened because they were being singled out and being described by either the former president or by Rudy Giuliani as having done something terribly wrong when there was no evidence that they had.
We're getting some new information from what's happening right now inside that courthouse. Let's go to our congressional correspondent, Scott McFarland, who is there. Scott, what can you tell us?
Jack Smith, the special counsel, has just entered courtroom 22, taken a seat at a bench near the prosecution table, and the prosecutors are now at this long rectangular table, each seated in a black rolling chair. We're waiting on the judge now, and we're waiting on the former president and his defense team to enter this courtroom to begin the proceeding. So many other January 6th defendants had their initial appearances this week, Nora. The court's been dealing with dozens of them each week, and in each case we watched, they made a virtual first appearance. They were given that opportunity for logistical reasons, and because of the caseload here, Donald Trump has chosen to come here in person today. Now, this is an event that is clearly invisible to America. No cameras here. He was taken through a private entrance, but being here does amplify the significance of this moment. He's about to walk in the courtroom and take his seat for the third time at a defense table in front of a judge. The first two times, I noticed it, seeing it face to face. He was slumped over, said little, made very few expressions, took very few notes. Let's see what he does today when he sits with his defense team in this distinctive January 6th case before a magistrate judge. And it's worth underscoring, Nora, this is the last time this magistrate judge is going to have the case. It moves next to U.S. Judge Tanya Chutkin, a 2014 appointee of then-President Obama, who has been among the only judges I've seen who has exceeded the prosecutor's recommendations for sentencing in January 6 cases. She toes a uniquely hard line.
And what about all of those January 6 defendants who have had a trial by jury, I should say? What has been the conviction rate?
100%, Nora. Every single January 6 defendant to go to trial by jury has been convicted at least partially. There have been only 2 acquittals of the 1,100 cases, but those were both trial by judge, and one of them was simply a misdemeanor case. The Justice Department is batting 1,000 in this unique dynamic in which Donald Trump now finds himself in a D.C. federal court where the juries have convicted everybody they faced with a tether to January 6th. One other note, there were other January 6th cases here earlier today, including a former Chicago police officer and a man named Jay Johnston, a former actor on the TV show Bob's Burgers.
Wow. And what is he accused of, Scott?
These are what we would characterize as lower-level cases, moderate-level cases. These are not people accused of conspiracy or sedition. These are people that were in that mob that day, allegedly. Donald Trump, facing this charge of obstruction of an official proceeding, joins 310 other Americans facing that charge for January 6th. And that conspiracy charge, conspiracy to obstruct, he joins roughly 55 others facing that charge for January 6th, according to our CBS News count.
This is serious business that the Justice Department has not taken this lightly. They have prosecuted them to the max. They have searched for years for each of these individuals involved, and they are not done.
And this particular judge, who has been chosen by random to oversee the Trump case, she has handed down particularly tough sentences against other January 6 defendants. In fact, in a few cases, she even handed down tougher sentences than DOJ was recommending. There were times when DOJ had recommended no jail time, and she decided to hand down a few weeks, a couple months of jail time. So she's she's pretty formidable.
Yeah, as you noted, this investigation has gone on for 2 years now. Hundreds, thousands of pieces of evidence, a lot of video evidence, and that's why the conviction rate is really pretty good, because they have video evidence of these people, many of them attacking police officers, attacking other people, going after members of Congress. So the evidence is there in many of these cases.
And this is all to hold a former president accountable. And there are three people who wanted to hold him accountable shortly after January 6th. One of them was Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, who said, we have a criminal justice system in this country. We have civil litigation, and a former president is not immune from being held accountable. Senator Lindsey Graham, an ally of the president, when it comes to accountability, the president needs to understand that his actions were the problem. The now Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy, the president bears responsibility for Wednesday's attack. Just to remind everybody that the leaders of his party, and of course Mike Pence we've talked about, all said the president was accountable for the events that led up to January 6th. This indictment obviously has 2 months worth of activity, not just what happened on the day. But when we think about accountability, the leaders of the party that he is the head of were the ones who were saying that he should be held to account.
So despite some of their more recent lack of statements or conversions, they at the time said that Donald Trump should face accountability. We've just been told that Donald Trump has entered the courtroom. Also in the courtroom is the special counsel, Jack Smith. And I want to spend a moment on Jack Smith because he is essentially who Donald Trump is up against in multiple of these indictments. The two, of course, the classified documents and the January 6th one. And they are sitting across from each other inside this courtroom. Jack Smith is someone who has run over and competed in over 100 triathlons. He was reportedly at one point hit when he was on his bike by a truck. And 10 weeks later, he ran another triathlon. This is a man of a lot of grit and a lot of determination. And even what we have seen in these indictments is just a sliver of what they know and his prosecutorial team knows, right?
His aggressive approach to his personal health and exercise correlates to how he approaches his prosecution and his strategy. We've talked a lot about how the former president is under pressure, but Jack Smith is also under pressure today. He is moving at an aggressive pace to try to move to what he has called a speedy trial of former President Trump. But he's going to face obstacles. We heard from Alina Habba, one of former President Trump's spokespeople. But the people who are likely to be in the courtroom today with Trump is a different set of lawyers. Todd Blanche, a veteran criminal defense attorney, Evan Corcoran, who's been working on the January 6th case with Trump for a long time. They are going to push the Judge Chutkan, in next week's status hearing, which they expect to happen, to delay this trial and to make sure that they have ample time for discovery. Delaying is central to what the Trump legal team is going to push for. They are going to argue, based on our reporting, that because of what's unfolding in New York, because of the classified documents case, which has thousands and thousands of documents already to sift through in discovery, that Trump cannot now move to a quick trial on January 6th, and they want to have time to talk to a lot of people in the discovery process. It will be critical, the decision made by Judge Chutkan about the timing of this trial. Will it occur before the presidential election? Because this has all the consequence for how it plays out.
And as you noted, the legal strategy now is a good time to bring in our esteemed legal analysts. And just before we do that, I do want to know we're getting some new information and reporting about Donald Trump. He has entered this courtroom. He is wearing a red tie today. He walked slowly over to the prosecution table. He sat down. We are told he is now seated between John Lauro to his left and Todd Blanche to his right. And he is speaking back and forth with his attorneys, looking around the room, even at the gallery at times, with his hands clasped. We will continue to update as we have reporters inside the courtroom, but to dig down into what Trump's legal strategy is and more on this indictment, let's bring in CBS News legal analyst Ricky Kleeman, and Scott Frederickson, a former federal prosecutor. Ricky, let me start with you. What about that legal strategy of delay, delay, delay? Could they have success with that?
Absolutely. Every defendant wants to delay. A delay means that a defendant is free for a longer period of time. This is an age-old strategy. But with Donald Trump, he has legitimate reasons to ask for delay because he is at the moment facing 2 other indictments with a possible indictment yet in Georgia. He's also running for public office. So yes, he may have success, whether it is in Washington, D.C. or any of the other jurisdictions, Nora.
And Scott Frederickson, let me ask you about that. They have also talked about, John Lauro on CBS said they'd like to move it to West Virginia. Do you think they'll have any success in doing that?
You know, that's going to go over like a lead balloon. That is, there's no basis whatsoever in the law for moving a case, changing venue. This is a typical challenge you find in high-profile cases, and those kinds of challenges always lose. The law is very clear. The way the court deals with the concerns that the defense has about getting a fair trial is to ensure that the judge and the both sides pick a fair jury, to pick juries who will set aside what they know and what they don't know or what they think, and commit to being objective triers of facts. But it's almost laughable to suggest that this is going to go to West Virginia. It's not going to go anywhere. There's no basis in fact for that challenge.
And Scott, your best guess about when this trial could begin?
Well, I think that's the big issue. I think that's the big issue facing Jack Smith right now. He's got a formidable case. You know, if I have to pick sides, I'd pick his shoes any day. And frankly, I think what he's hearing about advice of counsel and true belief, that's music to his ears. Those defenses fall flat on the face once you get in front of a jury. His challenge is to get this case to a jury before the election, if at all possible. And I think one of the things he's going to pitch is that this, of all the cases, goes to the core of what he is investigating. The charges are of constitutional and historical significance. I think he'll ask the judge to move this case ahead to the top of her docket and ahead of the Mar-a-Lago documents case.
All right, Scott, thank you. Want to bring in Tim Parlatore because he served as a Trump attorney for a brief period, but left due to differences with Trump advisor Boris Epstein. Mr. Parlatore joins us now. And Tim, thank you for joining us. First, want to start with you. I'm sure you have read through this indictment. What do you think is the gravest threat to Donald Trump included here?
You know, reading through this indictment, it actually was kind of surprising to me how little work Jack Smith had really done on this case to properly put together the required elements. This case, you know, most of the facts are undisputed because they happened out in public. The one key fact that they have to get over is knowledge. Did he know at the time that the claims of fraud were false? Did he know at the time that he'd actually lost the election? And reading the indictment, there really wasn't anything in there to indicate that Jack Smith had done his homework on that. Everything in there it said, you know, he was told by some people there was fraud. He was told by other people that there wasn't.
Tim,
who should he have listened?
Tim, I just happen to have it right here, page 7. So if you're following along at home, the claims were false and the defendant knew they were false. In fact, the defendant was notified repeatedly that his claims were untrue, often by the people of whom he relied on for candid advice. A, the defendant's vice president. B, the senior leaders of the Justice Department. C, the director of national intelligence. D, the Department of Homeland Security's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. E, senior White House attorneys. Let me just turn now to page 8. F, senior staffers on the defendant's 2020 election campaign. G, state legislatures and officials, many of whom were the defendant's political allies. And H, state and federal courts, the neutral arbiters. So what are you saying that he didn't do his homework? It's laid out here, A through H.
I'm saying that is something that looks great on paper, looks great in an indictment, and falls totally flat once you put it into a courtroom, because you have to have every single one of those people come in and testify about that. And they have to all be cross-examined. And so you go right down that list, every single one of them. Bill Barr is going to have to come in there and testify that, yes, he told President Trump that there was no evidence of fraud, but then he's going to be cross-examined. How many agents did you have go out and investigate? How many man hours were expended on that? How many witnesses did you interview? Did you send anybody to look at the machines? What did you do to actually verify any of these claims? Did you even sit with Mr. Giuliani to see what he was telling the president that you needed to go and verify? And the answer to those questions when it comes to Barr is going to be no to every single one of them. And so if you can't show that the people that are telling him there's no fraud had actually done an investigation, had actually done the work and could back it up by anything other than, no, we're not going to investigate because we don't think that there's fraud, then when it comes to a jury who has to find beyond a reasonable doubt that he knew, that's going to totally die. Again, it looks great in an indictment, but it dies in front of a jury.
The former Attorney General Bill Barr has said publicly on television, so I'm sure he would say it in a courtroom, that he did look into the claims and found no proof of election fraud.
And if he's subjected to actual questioning by an attorney during cross-examination, that's going to actually dig beneath the surface, not just accept those statements at face value, dig in to find out the details, I think that you're all going to be very surprised at what Mr. Barr has to say.
Tim Parlatore, thank you for joining us. Want to bring in Ricky Kleeman. And Ricky, is there a counter argument that you'd like to make?
Yes, there is a counter argument. First of all, I think that the indictment is a narrowly drawn, very pointed look at each of the crimes to satisfy each element of each offense charge. There is no doubt in my mind that Jack Smith has already written his closing argument when this indictment was drafted, because you have to look at the result when you look at the beginning. And Jack Smith has taken into consideration each witness that he is going to call, understanding that his burden is proof beyond a reasonable doubt, and understanding that they will be cross-examined. I have no doubt that Jack Smith can prove his case. Whether or not he can prove it to the satisfaction of a jury beyond a reasonable doubt is not for me to say. It's for a jury to say. But with all due respect to Tim, I do not think this is an indictment that is so bare that he cannot prove it.
Also want to bring in former federal prosecutor Scott Frederickson. And Scott, I just didn't understand the argument that Tim was making. And I am not a lawyer, but I've read the indictment, and there's multiple, which I just read on the air, instances where apparently the special counsel has lined up a lot of evidence.
Yeah, I'm mystified. And frankly, the kind of cross-examination that was suggested by Tim, with all due respect, is kind of fundamental 101 for prosecutors and defense counsel. That's walking into a trap, and Bill Barr will hit it out of the park and tell them about how they did have agents out in the field, and they did investigate, and they looked at video. They'll have evidence from each one that you listed there. There's not going to be any problem having them show up and testify at trial. And there'll be evidence of a respected private company that the president hired to look into the fraud, and they found nothing. That, I think, will be part of the overwhelming evidence you see. And by providing that evidence, that destroys the advice of counsel defense as well. You know, advice of counsel has to be based on true facts. It can't be based on false facts, manipulated facts, which is what this big steal argument was all about. And the president was told, not only by his attorney general, but top DOJ officials, his own White House counsel, the head of national intelligence, the head of cybersecurity, his family, his chief of staff, his top campaign officials. You know, when they get done testifying, I don't think the defense is going to want to get up and do any cross-examination. They're going to have to think of a different defense.
And just to build on what Scott Frederickson said, for Mr. Parlatore to suggest that it was the responsibility of the Attorney General to be the overseer of all claims of election fraud, Scott mentioned Chris Krebs, who was running the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency for the Trump administration, a Trump appointee. And 9 days after the election in 2020, Krebs issued a statement along with his agency saying, quote, "There is no evidence that any voting system deleted or lost votes, changed change votes or was in any way compromised. And this came as people who were named as likely co-conspirators, not named, but suggested as co-conspirators in this indictment, like Sidney Powell, were saying that there was foreign influence in this election. Trump's own appointees and officials, separate from anything the Justice Department was doing, said this election was as secure as any in history.
There's a mountain of evidence that the election was not stolen, and people who were Republicans that said it and investigated it, including multiple court cases. This is, at this point, undisputed other than in the political realm. I mean,
yeah, absolutely. And it happened in real time. I mean, these aren't details that were somehow uncovered by Jack Smith. We heard from Bill Barr publicly in real time. We heard from Chris Krebs publicly in real time. We heard from secretaries of state publicly in real time that there was no fraud that they uncovered in this election.
And as Scott mentioned, the courts took a look, too. The system for adjudicating these claims looked at them, and the president was shut out, which is to say he lost all of the cases.
Let's bring in Democratic Congressman and former January 6th committee chair Benny Thompson. He joins us now. And Mr. Chairman, thank you for joining us. Your committee did extensive work on what happened on January 6th. Much of that was referred to the Justice Department. I haven't had the chance to speak with you, but as you've read through this indictment, what stuck out to you?
Well, a lot of it was the body of work our January 6th committee uncovered. We talked to people all over the country, election officials, people who conducted campaigns for the candidate, and without almost to the person, they indicated that they found no real fault. As you know, a lot of our witnesses were Republican officials, and they basically said, we reviewed it, we recounted, and we could find nothing wrong. The testimony from the Secretary of State of Georgia says the same thing. And so we put on a body of witnesses that we think presented the fact that former President Trump knew he had lost the election, but he also knew through his other people that there was nothing there that said the election was stolen.
Mr. Chairman, I want to ask you, too, about the thought that there could be a trial of the former commander-in-chief not far from where you work every day in the U.S. Capitol, at that courthouse, which is the intersection of Pennsylvania Avenue and Constitution Avenue. What will that be like? What will that mean for our country?
Well, I think it's part of how we test our system of democracy. No one is above the law, not even the President of the United States. It has nothing to do with the timing of the election. I believe that the Department of Justice looked at a lot of our work and added it to their body of work and determined that something had gone amiss. And in presenting the evidence to a grand jury, obviously that grand jury agreed. I don't feel good about the fact that a former president of the United States is going on trial, but I do feel good that our system of democracy works in that if you are found guilty of any charge or if you are accused of it, you have your day in court. Donald Trump is no different. I'm convinced, based on our review of the facts, that, as you know, we made some recommendations that we think he did do some things wrong. But we were not a prosecutorial body, and that's why what you see with the special counsel is the logical step to determine ultimately whether or not Donald Trump is guilty.
Benny Thompson, the congressman who chaired the committee and heard hundreds of hours of testimony from more than 1,000 people, and of course, turning over those findings to the Justice Department. Chairman Thompson, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you. Nancy Cordes, you covered Capitol Hill. Now you're the chief White House correspondent. I mean, They did a lot. That committee did a lot of work, extensive work that we all covered here on CBS News and watched a lot of that evidence and testimony.
And it is hard to overstate how influential the findings of that committee were and how much influence they have had on this indictment that we're looking at right now. You know, this case was kind of in limbo at DOJ a couple of years after January 6th took place. It's not hard to see why. It was a novel case. Nothing like this had ever happened before. It was totally unprecedented legally, and of course it was politically fraught. But then the January 6th committee did the Herculean work of interviewing all of these people, some of them for the first time, putting together this compelling narrative and then saying to DOJ, and here are the criminal statutes that we believe you could pursue. And they sort of tied it up in a neat bow in a way that had not been done before. And what's the result? It's the indictment that you see this week.
To build on what Nancy just said, perhaps the most important thing Chairman Thompson's committee did is it brought Trump to the center of the story in terms of making him, in their view, the mastermind of this conspiracy. Recall what happened in the days after the Capitol attack. Democrats in the House and some Republicans mounted an impeachment process against Trump, and they impeached him. And they impeached him for inciting a riot. It was about Trump's conduct during the day of the Capitol attack. What was the first subpoena issued by the January 6th committee? It came in September of 2021, and it was about phone calls Trump was making to Giuliani and others from the White House on January 5th. What the committee uncovered through its reporting, through its interviews, is that Trump was driving this, not reacting to a rally. Trump was pushing this into motion.
And we saw that with the tweets, of course, that are outlined not only in the indictment that we're familiar with as well, the continued invitation to his supporters to come to Washington to not only stop the steal, but in his words, to essentially rally against this.
It's going to be wild.
It's going to be wild. Thank you
said.
very much. It's going to be wild. Yes.
Two other things from the January 6th committee. We've talked about it before, but it bears repeating, which is so much of the testimony came from people who were in the room and as close to the president as possible. And the January 6th committee put all that out there so that this wasn't just hearsay. This is people who were fact witnesses in the moment. It also cracked open some things. Remember, there was that fight over John Eastman's emails. And in that course of that, the U.S. District Judge David Carter looked at those emails and found that in one filing in Georgia on December 4th, that John Eastman said, wait a minute, we can't say that this many votes were for dead people. It turns out that's not true. But then they went ahead and said it anyway. Why is that important? Because one of the things at issue is whether the president knew that what he was saying was false and went ahead and said it anyway. And that was cracked open by the activities of the January 6th committee. Also true, Vice President Pence's lawyer, who testifies to the fact that the president was told by John Eastman that the scheme actually wasn't lawful. Again, to the heart of the special counsel's case.
So not only did he know that he lost the election, he knew that the claims that he was making were also false and made them anyway.
And engaged in a conspiracy anyway.
And the conspiracy was put on paper. It was John Eastman wrote a 2-page memo. And I remember when Bob Woodward and I found this memo, authored by John Eastman, it almost seemed unreal that this was put into paper, memorialized for history. The final point, the main thing here, Eastman writes to Republicans in Congress and Trump, is that Pence should do all of this without asking for permission.
I want to bring in Major Garrett, who is outside the courthouse, who has followed this also closely as well. Major?
A couple of things, Nora, on the atmospheric. Still very calm, still very quiet. Right after the former president arrived, they reopened Constitution and Pennsylvania Avenue, so a very small footprint in terms of slowing downtown D.C. down for this proceeding. I imagine when the former president leaves the courthouse behind me, those streets will be blocked again, but everything is flowing just as it normally would be right now. Just want to give you that atmospheric here on the plaza of the courthouse. A couple of things that Mr. Parlatore said that I think bear considering for a second. He said, under cross-examination, these witnesses will fall flat before a jury. That's the key phrase, before a jury. The Trump strategy is to find one juror, to hang that jury. And why do I think that matters in Mr. Parlatore's words? Because I have traveled the country. I've written a book about this topic, about the way we do elections, about the certification process, about the fact that there were 95% paper ballots, auditable paper ballots across our country in 2020, the highest percentage ever in a national election. And for those who believe what the former president says, there is no amount of evidence that will persuade them otherwise. None. And so what Mr. Parlatore is saying is put those witnesses on the stand and ask the former attorney general, well, did you go into the machines? Go into the machines. What are you talking about? The method by which you confirm a vote is to audit the paper ballots. And when the audit matches the ballots, that's how you know the election has been fairly certified and verified. There's no going into the machines. But if you ask a question and say, well, we didn't go into the machines, does that create a sliver of doubt? Does that create one iota of doubt that one juror might cling to? I'm telling you, when Mr. Parlatore described it that way, falls flat before a jury, he was explaining exactly that process that lies, as Robert Costa well knows, very near the heart of the Trump strategy.
And thank you, Major Garrett. Nancy, you have some of the numbers there as well.
Sure. I mean, it won't be hard to find that one juror. It might be a little more difficult in Democrat-leaning D.C., but recent polls have showed that 7 in 10 Republican voters or Republican-leaning voters still believe that Joe Biden did not legitimately win this election. 3 years later, they still believe that. That is near an all-time high. That shows you how effective Donald Trump's messaging really was way back then. And it also helps to explain why he's now polling above 50% in Republican primaries.
But the special counsel's job is to keep the eye on the ball. And the eye on the ball here is, even if he really thought this was true, despite this mountain of evidence, he went and engaged in activities that were outside the bounds of what you're supposed to do if you believe this is true. You're allowed to believe this, and then you run it through a system, and if you win or lose in that system, that's the way it works. You can't go around the system and engage in conspiracy. So there may be doubt about whether there's metaphysical certainty about the election. It doesn't matter the activities he engaged in, says the special prosecutor, were not allowed, regardless of what your underlying belief is.
An update about what's happening inside that courtroom. We have been told that the proceedings are now underway. The magistrate judge has taken the bench. That's about 20 minutes after Trump entered the courtroom. So to imagine that Trump had to wait for about 20 minutes before the judge entered must have been interesting to see what he was doing during that period. When the judge entered, Trump and the rest of the courtroom stood in attention and then were seated again. We have reporters inside that courtroom. I will continue to update on every detail as soon as I get it and share them with you. Want to bring in David Becker, who is our CBS News election expert. He also co-wrote The Big Truth, Upholding Democracy in the Age of the Big Lie, along with Major Garrett. David, good to see you. And on that note, about what some Republicans may believe and what the facts are and what has been adjudicated in the courts, where do we stand?
Well, you made a really good point just a moment ago about how the special counsel really laid out both knowledge of the general fact that the election wasn't stolen and some very highly specific facts that related to individual states that were laid out one by one by one. The allegation that 10,000 dead people had voted in Georgia. It turned out that that number was closer to 4 after an extensive investigation explained to him by Republicans who had voted for him. The allegations that there were over 200,000 more voters in Pennsylvania than had actually lived in Pennsylvania. That allegation is just false on its face and is very, very clear. And this is done time and time again. And we sit here now 1,003 days since the November 2020 election, and there still has not been one shred of evidence presented to all of the many courts all over the country that indicates that there was any significant fraud or malfeasance or the outcome was improper. We even have Republican law enforcement officials in Georgia having to enforce subpoenas against people who have claimed that there were fraud, but wouldn't show the evidence. This has happened over the course of the last over 1,000 days now. And again, what you see from the indictment is this list of all of the people, Republicans, all Trump voters, who were telling the president contemporaneously in November and December and January of 2020 and 2021 that what he was claiming was false after extensive investigation. You can imagine how Jack Smith and his colleagues will be bringing in witness after witness after witness. And if the best that the defendant can do is to say, well, tell us more about the investigation you did, that's going to be some very damning evidence that is going to just pile up over days of testimony. And then the real question becomes, does the defendant himself, former President Trump, the person who best knows his state of mind and knowledge at the point in time decide to testify on his own behalf and the risks that go along with that.
Someone asked me this question today. Is there any chance that a trial, when it happens, would be televised or you could hear audio of it live in a federal courtroom?
It's extremely rare. I mean, there's going to be efforts to do that in this case for sure. There are very good arguments that that the general public has a great interest in this proceeding. It may even be that both sides agree that they want it televised. That's going to be something we're going to see played out over time. But the pressures to televise this in real time, or at least release audio, are going to be pretty strong. And, you know, to be quite honest, there might be some serious benefits to the country as a whole to hear this testimony being presented.
And David, do you imagine that this trial could happen this year, early next year?
Probably closer to early next year. I mean, this is a trial where the facts are largely already known. I think the special counsel was very disciplined in how he laid out the indictment here so that it could move expeditiously to trial at some fairly early date. There's still going to need to be some time for the defense to prepare a defense, and the judge is, of course, going to allow that. That's going to take several months. But my expectation is the special counsel is going to ask for this trial to happen probably in the very early part of next year, and then sometime actually take place sometime in the first half of next year.
David Becker, thank you. A quick update from inside the courtroom. Trump has been sworn in. He stood up, raised his hand. The judge also instructed Trump on the schedule for the day, and Trump spoke into the microphone and said, "Donald J. Trump, John," at the request of the judge to state his name, and he said he is 77 years old. 77, he said to the judge from inside that courtroom. Want to bring in Jeff Pegues. And Jeff, you've heard the argument from Trump's attorneys. Why did it take the Justice Department so long to bring this case? And they are arguing for equal time. In other words, to delay the trial so that they would have equal time.
Listen, I wish every defendant in this country could have equal time to prosecutors in bringing a case, especially when an alleged crime has been committed. It just does not happen that way. And by the way, the FBI, DOJ, they were working on these cases even as the January 6th committee organized. And so while they did get maybe a head start with the help of the January 6th committee, they still had to go back and double check into some other facts. There's still a lot of work in this case because of the sheer volume of evidence. And then on top of that, you have 1,000 prosecutions, arrests, right? You have all these cases, and all these cases in a way mirror this case. Why did those people show up? Because President Trump told them to show up. And this is what they told the jury. This is what they told their defense attorneys. These are some of the arguments that they were making. And so during that time, the FBI is gathering evidence from some of these people who are already on trial and building a case, just as any corruption case progresses with the mob, with any type of big figure who has a lot of money. You take time with these cases. You cannot, and especially against a former president of the United States, you can't just go to court with some flimsy allegation. And that's why you have this 45-page document. But as I told you before, and what we've seen with these other cases, there's always going to be something else that the special counsel will put out in court documents. He won't say it. They don't make a lot of statements, but they'll put it in here. And so this is just the beginning. And when you hear Trump representatives, and I get their strategy, but their strategy right now is a political strategy. That is not going to work in a courtroom.
Meaning the Trump.
Oh, yeah. That is not
And it's a good point, because we already saw an additional count in the classified documents case where they put forward the additional count on the Iran documents. So to your point, this is just the beginning of what they had. Quickly, an update from inside the courtroom, just so everybody knows. The magistrate judge has read the 4 charges to Trump and the penalties, including the 20-year maximum sentence for the charge of conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding and an obstruction of an official proceeding. Trump remains looking at the judge as she slowly reads the charges and the max penalties. Trump has been read his rights, the right to remain silent, etc. Do you understand this, sir? Trump, yes. Right to an attorney, an appointment if you cannot afford. Do you understand that, sir? Trump, yes, I do. The judge has then ordered the prosecutors to produce all exculpatory evidence to the defendant. That's the latest update from inside the courtroom. And he has pleaded not guilty, I am told. Getting this in real time for you, everybody. Real time of exactly what is happening inside. Trump said not guilty out loud in the court. And that's the very latest information as we have Scott McFarland inside delivering this information to us in real time. Want to bring in Ricky Kleeman and Scott Frederickson again. And Ricky, on those legal matters that we have been talking about, does it matter how long the special counsel has taken when the Trump lawyers say it took too long, or why they're bringing it now? What are they trying to suggest? It doesn't matter.
Well, it doesn't matter in a court of law because it's not a legal defense. It may matter in the court of public opinion because the political message from the defendant's side is that this is a weaponization of the Justice Department in order to thwart his candidacy. But that has nothing to do with the courthouse. And I agree with Jeff Pegues 100%. If you start with a complex conspiracy case, you start at the bottom and you work your way up. And that's exactly what I assume happened here. I wanted to add one other point, which I think is important. Although I do think it's in the public interest to have this trial televised, I sat on the Federal Rules Committee that was the advisory committee to the United States Supreme Court about federal rules of criminal procedure, and fight as mightily as I did for the idea of criminal cases being televised. I was shot down. I do not believe that there is any way that a federal court will allow this to be televised, even if both sides want it. Last quick point, Nora. Of course, Donald Trump appeared today in person. He wants to show that he is unafraid, that he is someone who does believe that this is, to use his terms, a political persecution. So he was not going to sit at home and be on Zoom and enter a plea of not guilty. He wanted to stand tall so that we could talk about it, and so that ultimately, today, he can fundraise off of this appearance.
Ricky Kleeman, thank you. At this hour, Donald Trump pleads not guilty to federal conspiracy charges against him in this January 6th indictment that we just learned about this week. Our Justice Department producer, Robert Legary, has been delivering us these details, and our correspondent, Scott McFarland, is inside there as well. He's going to join us in just a moment with the very latest. Want to bring in the meantime, though, Scott Frederickson. And Scott, on that note, what do you think happens next? Tell us legally what happens next week, and then when this may begin, when the trial may begin.
The first thing we look for will be an order from Judge Chutkan setting a status hearing. Based on her reputation, you can expect that to happen fairly quickly. She's going to take this case and schedule it and work through things in a no-nonsense manner. She's a judge who is in complete control of the courtroom. She's very experienced. She knows what she's doing. So she'll move that along. And so we'll hear about a trial date very early, probably at that status hearing. And that's going to be the first fight we hear about. And so that'll be the first ruling we'll look to, is when Judge Chutkan schedules this trial. As I said, I think I'm probably a minority on this, but I think there's a good chance she tries to move this into early next year to try and make this case the first case that comes up for trial, if at all possible, just because of the seriousness of the charges. And
Scott, what's that going to look like? A trial of the former president of the United States right here in Washington, D.C. How long will it take? I mean, I'm just trying to imagine what this is going to be like.
Yes, it's almost something out of a novel. But, you know, our courts, especially in Washington, are built for this. We have an experienced judge. That's first and foremost. And, you know, this case, in some ways, is a lot less complicated than the Mar-a-Lago case. There are no classified documents. It doesn't require defense counsel getting a security clearance. Most of the evidence, I suspect, has already been out in the public thanks to the January 6th congressional investigation. Indeed, the complaint that, you know, why did it take so long? It's an irony that the Attorney General Garland, when he was confirmed, he did not want to investigate the president just because he thought it was the appearances would look bad, and so he deferred to the January 6th investigation by the U.S. Attorney's Office in D.C. But in the end, I don't think this becomes that complicated a case. We have high-profile witnesses. Obviously, President Trump will be at the defense counsel table. But I think this case is capable of being tried in a relatively reasonable time. By that, I mean we're probably talking at least a month. At least a month. The real point is when can Judge Chutkan get this to a trial?
Scott Frederickson, thank you. Want to bring in Scott McFarlane, who has been watching those court proceedings and can walk us through it. He's made his way outside the courthouse now. Scott, tell us what it was like inside. What was Donald Trump's demeanor?
Donald Trump leaned right into the microphone on the rectangular table in front of him and pleaded not guilty to these 4 felony counts accusing him of seeking to overturn the 2020 election, which he lost. The special prosecutor just said, Nora, they're not going to seek any detention of Donald Trump or strict release conditions. He's going to be released on a bond he doesn't actually have to post, an surety bond. And there's going to be a requirement he not talk to known witnesses in this case, keeping in mind much of his inner circle could be witnesses in this case. The proceedings are really a garden variety set of proceedings in this courthouse. They do this a dozen times a day. They read the charges. They asked if he'd like them to read the full indictment, all 45 pages. He declined that. They asked him if he needed a taxpayer-funded, court-appointed lawyer. He declined that. He has his own counsel. And a couple things jumped out at me just in his body language. Just like we saw in Manhattan a few months ago and in Miami earlier this summer, he's kind of hunched over, hands clasped, making no use of the pen and paper on the table in front of him, occasionally whispering with or hearing whispers from his attorneys on either side. But this time, Nora, unlike the last 2 times, he really was looking around the room, actively gazing at the spectators, keeping in mind among the spectators are some of the police officers who responded here on January 6th. The special counsel himself, Jack Smith's in the front row of the audience, and 5 sets of rows of spectators in the room, and Trump was looking to see who was there. He had 2 attorneys, one on either side, and he was facing what would be the jury box. And in essence, in between him and the jury box were the 3 prosecutors. His left shoulder was pointed toward the judge, the way this room is configured, so he turned his body, pivoted toward the judge, again still hunched over, again with his hands clasped, spoke in a moderate tone, not terribly forceful, not terribly loud. He said he's not guilty, and one distinctive thing, when the judge asked him his name, he said, quote, Donald J. Trump. John, referencing the J. And then when she asked his age, he said 77. Not 77, he said 77. This is going to wrap, and he's going to exit the same way he came in, through one of those secure underground garage entrances, still not accessible to photos. And when this all began, Nora, the judge kindly reminded everybody in the courtroom and the courthouse, no phones, no photos, no taking any video today.
Scott McFarlane, you always do such an excellent job recapping what happened inside that courtroom. Thank you very much. So now we have the former president of the United States pleading not guilty to these 4 counts against him. We're going to have this hearing next week where a trial date could be set, and it could be as soon as, well, it could be as soon as the end of this year or early next year, and will set us up for really an extraordinary moment.
Sometimes the details can tell you a lot. Scott's excellent reporting and casting Trump as someone who's a bit relaxed almost in that courtroom based on that reporting, saying his age is 77. It reminds me of my conversations with Trump over the years where he would talk about being familiar with the court system for 5 decades now, going back to his time in New York when a character like Roy Cohn, very controversial lawyer, was his top advisor, helping him navigate the thicket of legal and political and real estate worlds inside of New York City, crossing over from Queens into Manhattan. And this is someone who oftentimes has this attitude when he faces crisis. I interviewed Trump the day after Access Hollywood, and I said, everyone else around you is panicking, telling you should maybe think about quitting the race. And he said to me, I'll never forget, he said, don't you know what I've been through? I've seen everything. This is nothing. You don't understand me. You don't understand life. I've seen it all. And, well, he's seen it all today.
But he hasn't. This is nowhere near an Access Hollywood tape. I mean, this is different.
This is quite different.
This is different, yeah.
But what you're putting your finger on is that this has become routine for him. And usually when something comes routine, it's because we've seen it a lot. But the fact that this is routine is what's extraordinary, is that it's routine because it's been 3 times that he's been arraigned now. And that's, to be comfortable, to have it happen to you so many times that you start to get comfortable with it is, we're not just in new territory, we are acres deep into new territory.
Mm-hmm. I want to bring in Mark Short, who is the senior advisor to Mike Pence, in just a second, because we are in the midst of a presidential election, and Donald Trump is leading the polls by a wide margin. The former vice president's name, or the office of the vice presidency, is mentioned some 100 times in this indictment. And yesterday we heard from the former vice president, and he gave one of his strongest criticisms yet of Mr. Trump during a campaign stop in Indianapolis. Let's listen.
I want the American people to know that I had no right to overturn the election. And that on that day, President Trump asked me to put him over the Constitution. But I chose the Constitution, and I always will. Sadly, the president was surrounded by a group of crackpot lawyers that kept telling him what his itching ears wanted to hear. And while I made my case to him of what I understood my oath of the Constitution to require, the president ultimately continued to demand that I choose him over the Constitution. Our country is more important than any one man. Our Constitution is more important than any one man's career.
Joining us now is Mark Short, senior advisor for former Vice President Pence. Mark, thank you so much for joining us, and good to see you. Mark, what's your understanding of how many notes the former vice president had and was able to provide to the special counsel?
Nora, thanks for having me. I think, as you can imagine, the vice president of the United States is a demanding role where a lot of information flows in on a lot of different things, from national security issues to leading the COVID task force to handling legislation. And so it was his tendency to keep contemporaneous notes. But I think that the vast majority of those are things that honestly were reflected in his book. I think that the chapters that go back to the events surrounding January 6th leaned heavily on those notes. And so I'm not sure there was so much new in the indictment that hadn't already been shared with the American people.
Did the former vice president know, and did he also believe that Donald Trump knew that he lost the election?
I don't know that Donald Trump ever said to the vice president, or certainly when I was in their surroundings, that he felt he had lost that election. I don't know, honestly, Nora, to the extent to which the president's actions necessarily were criminal. I do know they were wrong, and I do know that he violated his oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. I do know he asked the vice president very specifically to violate his oath to the Constitution. And I think that, at this point, the prosecution probably has plenty of witnesses from the campaign who testified they informed the president that he had lost, that any evidence of fraud was insignificant and would not have changed any of the results. I think you probably have other witnesses that have testified that from the legal counsel in the White House, they informed the president that the vice president had no such authority. And, one person that I think is certainly not mentioned in the indictment, but was in many cases the ringleader, the organization of this in the White House, is Mark Meadows. And so I certainly believe he probably has testified extensively as well about the president's thoughts and what the president knew at this point. And so I don't know, again, to what extent these actions will bear out to be criminal, but I do know that they're wrong, and I do know that the vice president upheld his oath that day.
I know the vice president has spoke to this in the past, but I want to ask you today, would he be willing to testify against Donald Trump at a trial?
Well, I don't know about answering that hypothetical now, Nora. I think that much about the dynamics between the president and the vice president played out very publicly. It seems that much of the uncertain part of this is the conspiracy as to what he knew and didn't know, and whether or not the vice president's called to testify. I think he always has followed the law, and so would presumably do so in this case, but no indication of that at this point.
We talked about earlier some of the phone calls and the contemporaneous notes that Mike Pence has provided to the special counsel, including from a phone call on New Year's Day where Donald Trump berated Mike Pence, asking him to overturn the election. And Mike Pence replied he didn't have the authority to return or reject votes. And Trump told him, "You're too honest." Nancy Cordes has provided us with a picture of the merch that your campaign is now selling that says "Too Honest" on T-shirts and hats. How is that merch selling?
Well, Nora, I think that in the last couple of days, the vice president has received an enormous amount of support and thousands of additional donations. And I think that, I think what's fundamentally to your question is something important about, overturning versus sending it back, because I think that is part of the narrative that's been out there by the president's lawyers about just sending it back. I think it's important for your viewers to know that the request all along was for the vice president simply to reject states' electors. It was to overturn the election. In fact, Donald Trump even said so prior to the former vice president's speech to the Federalist Society a couple years ago, that he'd asked the vice president to overturn the election. I think in later time they believed the PR of saying simply send it back to the states sounded better. And that was something that they turned to in the last 36 hours. And there's even notes from John McEntee in the White House saying, since Pence won't go along with the overturning election, let's pivot to this theory. And that theory really is one that has the same ultimate end, because the notion was if somehow something could be returned, which the vice president doesn't have that authority, and no vice president in 250 years has, nor do Republicans want Kamala Harris to have that authority. But hypothetically, if it did, the idea was you get below the 270 threshold in Electoral College, and it returns to the House of Representatives to get a different result on the election. And so it sounds nicer, but ultimately the impact would have been the same.
Mark Short, senior advisor to Vice President Mike Pence, his former chief of staff. Mark, thank you so much for joining us.
Nora, thanks for having me.
And we are being told that the proceeding has ended inside that courthouse. We will likely see Donald Trump escorted out at some point. We could hear from the former president at some point this afternoon. It's unclear what time, but we are being told that he may speak before cameras at the airport before returning back to his club in Bedminster, New Jersey. Nancy, I want to talk to you about this because it is extraordinary in this indictment, the details and the evidence, but also the contemporaneous notes, as we've noted, that are made by Mike Pence that the special counsel uses as evidence.
Right, and it wasn't just Mike Pence. There are so many people who were in the president's orbit who also relayed what he told them. And something that we haven't really discussed much yet is the fact that, according to the January 6th committee, and the indictment touches on it as well, this actually started not on Election Day, but well before Election Day, much to the frustration of Republican leaders around the country. The former president, he could see the polls, and he started to say things like, well, if I lose, it's because the election was rigged. And he started telling some of his supporters, don't use mail-in ballots because those are rigged. And you had so many Republican leaders saying to him, please don't say that to our supporters. Republicans historically vote in larger numbers than Democrats using mail-in ballots. If they don't think those ballots are safe, that's going to depress our mail-in ballot voting. And there's good evidence that that is exactly what happened. But the case that that this indictment makes, and certainly the case that the January 6th committee made, was that he started laying the groundwork to make this argument months before the first vote was even cast.
And just to remind everyone that Donald Trump lost by a fairly wide margin to Joe Biden. It was 74 electoral votes, and he lost the popular vote by 7 million votes.
And Mark Short, who just spoke with CBS News, is a crucial figure in this story. Mark Short was present when the Trump campaign, the night before the insurrection, issued a public statement saying Mike Pence agrees with everything Donald Trump is saying about this election. And based on our reporting, and we believe the special counsel has the same information, Short erupted. How can the president of the United States speak for the vice president and lie about him publicly? But Boris Epstein and Rudy Giuliani and so many others close to Trump were still trying to go maybe even over to Pence's home at the Naval Observatory to try to get him to come along. One of Pence's advisors, Marty Opes, remarked to others, it almost felt at that moment like a bad mafia movie. We were being hustled. We were being pushed around. And Mark Short was there telling Pence, hold the line. And Pence agreed with Short. But it was a pressure cooker of a moment. And think about this story on January 4th, 2021. Donald Trump is supposed to get on Marine One, his helicopter, but he doesn't want to get on it just yet. He wants to call Pence to the White House. So Marine One is whirring around on January 4th for a long time, and Trump calls Pence into the Oval Office and confronts him once again. And Short is in the room, who you just spoke with Pence, as Trump says, I'm not going to get on that helicopter until you agree with me that you're going to do what I want on January 6th. And Pence pleads with Trump, I'm trying to do what I can. I'm listening to my lawyers. And Trump says, do what I want. And then he goes to Georgia that night, and he says publicly, Mike, you better do what I'm telling you to do. And Pence and his advisors are watching that night on January 4th after that conversation in the Oval Office, which we can see on our screen. And they're saying to themselves, what have we gotten ourselves into? And now we know, in the eyes of the special counsel, a possible criminal conspiracy.
It's kind of breathtaking when you describe it in all of the details. It's incredibly breathtaking in the pressure campaign, as you noted.
And just a tiny little textual thing for Mike Pence, who kept an open Bible on his desk. That itching ears comes from Timothy, heaped to himself teachers in accordance with his own lusts. Basically, that's the scene you're describing, is surrounding himself with people who would only tell him what he wanted to hear.
And for Mike Pence, when Trump goes to him on January 5th, he says, Mike, if the mob outside wanted you to do this, wouldn't you want to do it? Wouldn't you want to do it? And then Trump famously, this has been confirmed by testimony before the January 6th committee, Trump opens the door to the Oval Office on a freezing cold night so he can hear the mob outside on Freedom Plaza. They're playing songs. I was actually walking around that night with a notebook in hand. I remember a few things. Rats were in the streets. Cops were everywhere. Proud Boys and Oath Keepers and nobody else, because it was the pandemic. Nobody was in Washington, D.C., except those planning an insurrection. But even I look back, I could have never imagined what would happen the next day. It seemed impossible in our political and legal imagination that this kind of thing could happen in this country. I just never would have imagined even seeing the Proud Boys in front of me.
Yeah, I was at the Capitol that day, and you know, even as it was unfolding, we kind of couldn't believe it. I mean, the fact that the Capitol itself was being breached.
We were live on the air for 9-10 hours straight, watching it unfold in a way that is still hard to believe, even now, having watched the January 6 hearings and read this indictment. I want to bring in Scott McFarland because he is outside the courtroom and has a little bit more details about what was this 27-minute long proceeding. Is that right, Scott? And what happened and what's happening there right now?
And Nora, the judge kept Trump waiting. He was sitting idle in his seat for about 20 minutes because the proceedings began late. And the Trump defense team, before this hearing just wrapped, has already begun the process of seeking to delay the case. The judge gave them 3 choices for the next court appearance: August 21st, August 22nd, August 28th. The Trump team promptly responded August 28th. And then the defense attorney for Donald Trump told the judge they may need more time. They may need to waive some of these speedy trial rights they have because they have to review all the evidence in the case. In a case where timing is everything, less than 6 months before the Iowa caucuses, on the eve of this enormous 2024 campaign season, a former president who's also the frontrunner for his party's nomination is now, to a degree, fighting the clock. And so are prosecutors in all 3 cases. The real timing in this case ultimately will be up to the U.S. district judge who gets this case next, beginning August 28th. That's Judge Tanya Chutkin. I got to tell you, though, standing here at this moment, the resonance of January 6th can be felt. We're surrounded by police bike rack barricades, the same ones that were toppled down the street January 6th. Some of the Capitol Police officers there that day were in the courtroom, and on the other side of this camera lens, you can see the U.S. Capitol. This case is just going to be different, Nora. It's going to land different with some number of Americans.
Scott McFarlane, who has covered so many of those January 6th trials and kept track of them. If you follow his Twitter feed and reporting here for CBS News, it has been detailed unlike anybody else. Really has done such extraordinary reporting. Scott, thank you. We want to show you, this is the Trump motorcade as they have left the courthouse in downtown Washington, not far from the U.S. Capitol. The intersection of Constitution and Pennsylvania Avenue, going through the E Street Tunnel, if my directions are correct. I think that's, and then on his way back to the airport, where he will then return to Bedminster. It's not clear yet, although we could hear from Donald Trump. You know, we were thinking about, just as this next appearance is August 28th and then a potential trial, who is Trump's legal team? He has been through so many lawyers, including Tim Parlatore, who we heard from earlier, who was making some specious arguments. But who is this team, and how will they handle sort of the weight? I mean, don't you need a whole group of people to deal with charges like this? You usually need a whole law firm.
You usually would get a law firm, but that's not happening here. Most law firms have looked at this situation with the former president facing criminal conspiracy charges, a New York hush money case, Mar-a-Lago documents case, and the Georgia case that's upcoming with a charging decision, and said, no thanks. Todd Blanche, who's leading the legal effort for Trump right now, he left his law firm and he's at the helm at the moment. He's working with John Lauro, who has been on CBS in recent days. And they're the point people. Evan Corcoran's in an awkward position because he's one of Trump's lead attorneys on January 6th, but he's also part of the Mar-a-Lago investigation as a witness. So the special counsel has forced Corcoran to leave Trump representation on Mar-a-Lago because he was involved with how the documents were signed with the FBI and the National Archives, yet Corcoran's still there today in Washington with Trump on January 6th. When I've asked sources close to Trump's legal team, is a law firm in the offing? Could someone be coming on? They say no. This is a limited team, and they're going to focus on the political message as much as the legal message.
Well, because that's easier, too. Because think about it, just in this case, the January 6th committee report was 800 pages. This is 45 pages, this indictment. But think about getting your head around 800 pages and then all the secondary material if you're trying to mount a defense. And that's just one of the four. And you could argue there are even more cases if you talk about some other civil cases. But that's just one of the four challenges for these lawyers. It's just a tonnage of work.
And they want to take this to the Supreme Court. I mean, if you really want to boil down their strategy to one thing, is if convicted, appeal all the way to a Supreme Court they believe is conservative and might rule in their favor on issues like speech and advice of counsel.
I mean, don't you need the best lawyers in the country in order to defend yourself on something like this?
That's what I find so interesting about your reporting, Bob. When you've been talking to sources about this, do these large law firms not want to take the case because they're worried it will scare other big money clients off, or because they've seen what happens to Trump lawyers, they end up getting into trouble themselves?
Well, look at how Nora so aptly introduced Timothy Parlatore. She said in her introduction that he left his work as counsel for Trump because of disagreements with Boris Epstein, who's a Trump lawyer and political advisor. Trump's inner circle.
He may also be the unknown co-conspirator.
That's right, because Boris Epstein, I know there are a lot of names here. It's like Watergate, all these different currents of information and a tree of people. But Epstein was close to Giuliani. Epstein's also someone who's always telling Trump, based on what we've learned, what he wants to hear. And there's a real division in Trump's legal team about happy talk versus frank talk, and when to be political and when to be focused on the legal brass tacks.
Former Attorney General Bill Barr was asked about what these lawyers working for the former president should do, and he said, get a lot of insurance, because the president has churned through lawyers and then also people who've been close to him.
Mm-hmm. And he always turns to outside lawyers. Why did John Eastman and Sidney Powell become part of the inner circle? Because they told Trump what he wanted to hear. Mm-hmm.
This is such a momentous day, and yet it may not be the last indictment of Donald Trump, because we are awaiting news from Georgia, and that's where Nicole Killian is for us today. And Nicole, what's the very latest from there?
Well, we are nearing the end of a 2.5-year investigation, and we know this not because of the dark clouds that may be hanging over the courthouse, but more specifically because earlier this afternoon we got some guidance from the Fulton County Sheriff's Office announcing road closures around the courthouse beginning Monday for the next 2 weeks. And that is the tentative window that we expect Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis to present evidence to a grand jury and ultimately to announce a charging decision in her investigation into election interference during the 2020 election. So some overlap to a certain extent with this federal case in terms of some of the facts. Of course, at the centerpiece of this investigation is that infamous call that the former president made to Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger saying, find me the 11,780 votes. In fact, we heard from the Secretary of State earlier this week here in Georgia after this indictment was announced in Washington. He said that this was expected. He continued to defend his actions as well, saying that we ran the traps on all of these false election claims. And so it's important to note, because Raffensperger not only talked to federal prosecutors, but also was a key witness here in this Fulton County investigation, which heard from some 75 witnesses, including many members of the former president's inner circle. So a lot of attention will be here on Georgia in the next couple of weeks. The district attorney has made clear that she is ready to go, Nora.
Wow, Nicole Killian with that new reporting there from Georgia about what may be happening as soon as next week. And yet, Nancy Cordes, as we heard that, the thought, and I used the mountain of evidence, but I'm thinking it's like a tsunami of evidence and these cases and that's facing Donald Trump. There was an extraordinary meeting between President Obama and President Biden recently in which Obama had a warning for Biden. What have you learned about that meeting?
Well, I've learned that this was a lunch that took place in June. We knew about the lunch and the fact that it was taking place at the time, but it has since been reported that former President Obama warned the current president, Joe Biden, don't take Donald Trump for granted. He's still a very formidable opponent. Obviously, his supporters are extremely loyal to him. Obviously, they're still willing to give him money, even though millions of those dollars are clearly going directly, not to campaigning, but to his defense. And he urged him not to, to take it very seriously, and told him that he would do everything that he could to help him out.
Some important context, just as people think that this may be so many legal troubles that Donald Trump is in. Even the Democrats and President Obama believe that Trump is formidable as a Republican nominee. And Robert, in this indictment, of course, there are the 6 co-conspirators. What do we know about them? How could they figure in a potential trial?
Here's what CBS News is learning about these alleged co-conspirators of Trump. These were central figures orbiting around Trump in the final days of the administration. You have Rudy Giuliani, who took over the legal strategy in the days after the election, collected affidavits, tried to fight it in the courts, then pressured election officials in the states to do Trump's bidding. John Eastman comes up with the plan to have Mike Pence walk away from the lectern on January 6th and set into motion a constitutional crisis. Sidney Powell was arguing that Trump should seize voting machines based on alleged conspiracy theories about foreign interference in the election that have never been proven in any way. Then you had Jeffrey Clark, who Trump wanted to name acting attorney general after Bill Barr resigned in December of 2020. Clark was someone who Trump believed could take a tighter grip over the Justice Department and potentially provide him with the fodder he needed to put the DOJ into action to do what he wanted. Then you had Ken Chesborough, who wrote a memo similar to Eastman, arguing that alternate electors should be selected in the states and come to Washington to enable Trump to have that election in the House, as we've discussed. And the final co-conspirator, we believe, could be Boris Epstein, who we discussed, who was working closely with Giuliani at the Willard Hotel on January 5th, helping Giuliani at every turn with the alternate electors based on our reporting. Or it could be Mike Roman, a Trump campaign lawyer who was also enmeshed in and intertwined with what was going on with the alternate electors scheme. We're learning more, but just because they're co-conspirators doesn't mean they're going to be indicted. It also means they could be indicted. Mm-hmm. And they're not just 6 people, what we're learning from the special counsel and our sources close to it. There will likely be more who come forward in the coming weeks in terms of legal filings, as Jeff has discussed.
There could be more to come. And as we wrap up our coverage and see the president arriving now at Reagan Airport to depart back home, John Dickerson, today is just the beginning, and I just keep thinking of it as the first step, and covering this trial will be like anything I've ever done in my political reporting career.
Because it won't just be the attorneys who have to jump from trial to trial. I mean, this date on the 28th coincides. There's another date in the Florida case on the 25th. The coverage of all these different cases will be happening simultaneously. And also, we've been talking about the campaign calendar. There's also the jury box of the electorate out there. The president is asking that the behavior as detailed in this indictment and his rebuttals against that detail, that he be ratified and reelected by the public for the way he behaved. That's another element of this, and that's not the burden of proof there is up for grabs. But that's kind of the 5th event or 6th event in addition to all of these trials.
Mm-hmm. Today, we witnessed former President Donald Trump arraigned here in Washington in a federal courthouse on 4 counts related to his attempts to overturn the 2020 election. One of the central figures and possible witnesses in the special counsel's case is former Vice President Mike Pence, and the former Vice President will be a guest on this Sunday's Face the Nation with Margaret Brennan. Our coverage will continue on CBS News streaming your local news, and we're going to have a full wrap-up tonight on the CBS Evening News. This has been a CBS News special.
I'm not going to live in here.
Well, thank you very much. This is a very sad day for America. And it was also very sad driving through Washington, D.C. and seeing the filth and the decay and all of the broken buildings and walls and the graffiti. This is not the place that I left. It's a very sad thing to see it. When you look at what's happening, this is a persecution of a political opponent. This was never supposed to happen in America. This is the persecution of the person that's leading by very, very substantial numbers in the Republican primary and leading Biden by a lot. So if you can't beat him, you persecute him or you prosecute him. We can't let this happen in America. Thank you very much.
Do you want these trials to happen before the 2024 election?